lot of people consider restrictiveness in a unit to be strictly a bad thing, but is that really the case? Let's talk about it. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. You can easily make the very simple argument of, they could have simply removed XYZ restriction on them, then they would have been way better. Sure, but there's a little something called game balance. I'm not an expert on anything related to that, and I won't pretend to be, but we should at least lay down the basic foundation. Restrictive units are restrictive for a reason. The real question is, do they provide value equivalent to how much their restrictions hurt their overall usability? And is it really that bad for units to be restrictive if they do their jobs well? Let's think of some characters which have restrictions. Chevres, for example, limits you down to using only Pyro and Electro teammates. This has a domino effect as you can't use Yunjin and Clorox overload teams. However, despite locking you out of using both Kazuha and Yunjin, she still ends up being best in slot and Raiden Hyper teams while also providing a really good Chlorand team option. She opens up less powerful albeit viable routes for other units too, such as Overload for the two top tier Pyro DPSs. She is quite literally the very definition of a restrictive unit, because her kit refuses to function if you try to play her in any other way aside from what was intended for her. There are also restrictive units in the sense of not being able to work in other teams because they don't provide anything to them. For example, Shenhe would be a restrictive unit in the sense that you can only ever use her with cryo units. Farazan is restrictive in the sense that you can only ever use her in teams where the main DPS deals animo damage. Something that should be noted is that just because a unit might offer a niche buff that doesn't apply to every team, doesn't mean that they're a restrictive unit. Xian Yan is an extremely effective versatile unit. Even though she has a buff which is specific to plunge playstyles, you can choose to ignore that in favor of focusing on the rest of her kit. Therefore, she does not count as being restrictive. There are also different levels of restrictiveness when it comes to a Genshin unit. Yunjin can be used with pretty much any normal attack DPS and buff them pretty well, whereas someone like Farazan won't have any value for an animo DPS like Chaska who doesn't primarily deal in animo damage. Here's the thing, I think that as long as the unit is actually best in slot at what they do, and as long as they aren't easily replaceable with a more generally versatile option due to offering similar buffing qualities, then having restrictive units is actually not a bad thing at all. Not every unit can be some insane Archon tier flexible legend that works in every single team. That'd get boring really fast while not honing in on any specific team. Restrictive units of good kits can seriously spice up the meta in interesting ways, such as Chevres having saved Overload. Shoot, Autoron is coming up and he's finally about to give Electrocharged a spot on the map again. Restrictive units simply need to achieve their goal well in order to be worth it. If a unit of this nature is made to be equal to or worse than the more versatile option, then yeah, they're kinda pointless. But if they're a strong niche unit, then having dedicated teams is not a bad thing. Having some hyper-flexible, super reliable characters is definitely good so that there's a clear roster to aim for when starting off your account. You're not going to recommend Shenhe to somebody who started yesterday over a copy of Shilunen, for instance. Well, not only would that recommendation suck, but it'd be kinda useless considering that Shenhe got killed off of banners 2 Hoyo games ago. But more specific units that tend to particular niches open the opportunity for Hoyo to explore very specific buffs which might benefit a certain team. They wouldn't be able to provide overly specific benefits without hurting the character's general flexibility. They have pulled it off in the past in fairness, with Xian Yan like I said earlier, yet even so, hyper-specific team options are able to act as a specific upgrade to a particular team that you may like, while not harming the overall viability of the more versatile option. A C6 Chevres is better than Kazuha in Raiden Hyper, right? That doesn't mean she's better than him. The Twink's an S tier, whereas the Cop is more so an A tier unit, but that doesn't change the fact that Chevres was a super healthy addition into the meta that allowed Raiden fans to receive an upgrade while not doing any harm to Kazuha's lofty meta position. That's not to say that a character being restrictive is entirely a good thing. Right from the get-go, if that unit is a 5-star, interest will instantly plummet. Locking a 5-stars kit to working with only a small handful of characters while costing a ton of primo gems is severely unappealing to a crud ton of people. Understandably so, since it sets the barrier to entry quite high. You need to own a certain group of units first before you can think about using another group of units. Even if the buffs they provide justifies their rarity, a character like that is always going to be infinitely less appealing than a unit that can work in a lot more situations. Besides, you can design a character kit which thrives in a certain niche while not completely falling apart when they're put into other teams. After all, if there's one nice thing that Genshin has with its team building, it's that you're able to be creative with how you utilize character kits regardless of how you're supposed to build them. For example, while Emily was obviously intended to be used in Burning or Burgeon teams of Kinich, you can forego doing that in favor of playing her as a national driver with Pyro Infusion thanks to C6 Bennett. Or shoot, you could even drop Burning altogether in favor of using her over Nihida when playing Sino, so that you can have some actual freaking multi-wave in his Dendro-based teams. So if a character literally refuses to work outside of their given niche, that can feel a bit suffocating when trying to plan creative teams. Another issue is that if a character's niche decides to take a backseat when it comes to meta viability, they basically become obsolete as a unit until that niche comes back again. For example, Ayaka used to be one of the best DPSs in the game during the Inazuma era of Genshin, so when Shenhe released, she was seen as an elusively excellent premium support who would carry you to victory with ease. She massively bolstered the numbers of one of the game's best DPSs at the time, so how could she not be good? Cut to now, and Shen has honestly been killed off of banners for a reason, man. Cryo is in an absolute joke of a state right now, with Riesli and Charlotte being two of the most meta-relevant Cryo characters right now. Being the best Cryo unit means that you're a mid-general unit, though. It's kind of the bar to be a good unit within the context of that element in this current day and age. So placing heavy restrictions upon limited units can be kind of dire, since the unit becomes essentially useless to you if their team archetype falls off. Back when Shenhe released, Cryo was actually in the running for being one of the best elements in the game. That's probably really hard to believe if you're a newer player watching this, but yes. For the first 2 years of Genshin, the meta was mostly ice-based, accompanying the ever-popular Vape archetype, which is still best installed to this day. Hydro was generally considered better, but there was an actual reality in which Cryo was considered impressive. People were convinced that Freeze was an eternal team archetype, and that we'd never get yearly meta shifts like we do now. That's another thing, you can't really predict the longevity of an overly restrictive character. Neely was released back in Sumeru, and Bountiful Core's Bloom was an incredible AoE team. But now that we have much better team options, while I still consider Nilu comps to be within A tier, she's definitely not as busted as she used to be, and because you can't really improve upon Bountiful Cores any further, because Nilu is supposed to be the team's improvement, she's essentially stuck in this state until further notice. Though something else to note is that restrictive is somewhat of an umbrella term. Autodon technically counts as restrictive because he wants Notlon characters or electrocharged in his team, but by asking for Night Soul bursts, he opens up his team options just that bit more, and sometimes a super versatile unit can have a restriction placed on them. Nobody's saying that it's always best in slot to follow that, however. New Vallette's past Draconic glories? First off, cheer up dude, it's current Draconic glories. You're literally the best DPS in the game by a ridiculous landslide. Secondly, people were pretty quick to discover that this passive was not worth prioritizing over using Farina in his teams. Sure, C1 would help as it'd get you the best of both worlds, but it's by no means required if you want to play Farina and New Valette together. That is indeed a restriction placed upon his full C0 potential. However, the Hydro Dragon is one of the most versatile, flexible units in the game. You genuinely have to have gone mad to call this dude restrictive to any degree. Then there's Linny's Pyro passive. Sure, this is a good buff to his numbers, but it never takes priority over using Farina or Emily with him. Effective team building and having an understanding of what works best for them takes precedence over maxing out their kit in both of these unit circumstances. Yes, it's annoying that these restrictions are here in the first place, but they can be overcome with creativity and game knowledge at times. Those situations are much different versus an entire unit who is restrictive. The consequences of Linny's passive are much different compared to the consequences of Nilu and Chevreuse rejecting all teammates who can't contribute to causing the reactions that they desire. Small restrictions placed on generally good units tend to get doom posted a lot. I think the one time where the confusion was justified was with Kokomi, because her gimmick was so new at the time and nobody really knew what to make of her not being able to crit. In her case, she was designed around that strange concept to encourage building a unit in a different way, which in fairness was pretty interesting at the time because every other DPS was an attack scaler. But it didn't work since in the end she got reduced to Hydro applying off-fielder anyway, which checks out. Hoyo didn't tune her to do enough damage to justify the DPS gimmick working. Otherwise, when everybody freaked out because Xian Yan was a plunge support, calm down fellas. Also, there's only so many universal supports until Hoyo starts slowly rehashing old concepts but brushing them up to be better to spruce up the meta. Shoot man, Shilonen is just Kazuha 2 but with healing and the ability to buff Geo as well. Yes, they become more distinct as you get more constellations, but you get the point. Sometimes small restrictions are fair game if it makes for a more interesting meta. The game's pretty old now too. I think that we all know that we're gonna start delving into some more niche unit concepts as time goes on. There's still some bases that we haven't covered yet, such as a Hydro Claymore user, but I'm hoping that we'll get there in time. Small restrictions are enough to slightly differentiate characters from each other, but it's enough to make all the difference when choosing who to pull for. It can lead to interesting ideas too. Shilonen can't res shred in teams of 3 Geos or 2 Geos and 1 Anemo or Dendro, opening the way for DPS Lonen to fit smoothly within her kit. Sure, it came at the cost of res shred in mono Geo teams, but the end result still produced something rather interesting. Whether it was worth the cost or not is up to you to decide. There's Chaska too, being an Anemo DPS that breaks the mold by not being an Anemo DPS. She deals elemental damage and doesn't use Forzon in her main teams due to not dealing green numbers primarily. Once again, you yourself can decide whether that's a pure positive or negative or perhaps in between. I'd say that a balance is the best way to go. No, restrictive units are not entirely a bad thing. I don't think absolutely every unit should become hyper-specific, that'd get boring just as quickly as too many general units would. A balance is the best way to achieve a consistent middle ground in which people are receiving their flexible DPSs and running into more niche units along the way who can help said units reach their full potential. A range is good. Some Chevresses, some Xianyuns, and then some units who literally couldn't care less about restrictions at the cost of being more generalist characters on the whole. That's at least how I'd handle it. Oraron was executed really well, and so was Chevres, so I don't really have any reason to feel like more would be a bad idea, considering how both helped out the reactions in a super major way. I'm glad that people seem to be receiving restrictive units with more open arms, since everybody seems to agree that Oraron's kit is pretty darn fire. As it stands, not all characters themselves haven't been overly restrictive yet. Sure, they have their preferred team comps, but they themselves don't have any specific demands when it comes to what they want out of their teammates. As it stands, Night Soul is used for the character's kits, but if we get some Not 1 units who need others to use up Night Soul to function, that's where I fear that doom posting may occur. Thankfully, everyone seems fine with the fact that Oraron requests Night Soul bursts and electrocharged. After all, the cost is relative to his performance. But if that does end up being the case, I'm gonna wait and see. Some interesting Not cores could be formed out of that concept. Either way, I've never been against niche or restrictive units, and I will continue to be in favor of them. They're a necessary evil to keep things feeling fresh and interesting, while being able to tailor to certain teams that need the help far more specifically. But what do you think about the concept of restrictiveness on a Genshin unit? Does it do more harm than good, or does it help keep things unique and fresh? Let me know down below in the comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Hopefully this video is able to feed you some food for thought regarding whether varying degrees of kit restrictiveness is truly a negative thing for characters to have. This has been Juice, signing out. And does this debacle even matter when Hoyoverse reruns their more niche characters like once every solar eclipse?